I want to spend some time talking about the actual data or responses that we get back from the Web API. Because a lot of times when we use the Web API, we aren't just asking it to do something server-side and then forgetting about it. A lot of times we are actually getting a response back that we're going to use in our applications. So for example, if we add a new product via the Web API to our product database, that's going to give that product an ID, and we need that ID on the client side so we can do things like make hyperlinks to it and refer to it again. We may do a query and get several products back, and we're going to use that product data to display a grid or a parent-child relationship of some kind. So a lot of times our client is going to get stuff back from the Web API, and usually this happens in one of two formats. And we're going to talk about JSON here at first because this is JavaScript object notation, and it is a lightweight data format. And the reason that we call it a lightweight data format is because prior to JSON becoming popular, probably XML was the most common way to exchange data between services and clients in sort of a disconnected web fashion. And if you've ever used XML before, you know that XML has quite a good deal of rules and additions to it. You've got markup, you've got attributes, you've got rules for what elements can and can't repeat, you've got schemas that define an XML structure. You've even got a transformation language to transform XML into other kinds of data representations like HTML. And this is all good stuff, and it's not going away anytime soon. But the beauty of JSON is that a lot of times if you're developing, say, a web application, you don't really need a lot of the stuff that XML is set up to offer. All you really need are the names and the values back arranged in some kind of pattern so you can tell what the object was. So you can pull that data out and then use it in your HTML or whatever it is you're going to do. So JSON is a way of structuring data the way JavaScript objects are defined. And when we do that, not only do we get a much lighter weight object that goes over the wire much easier and more efficiently, but it's also already in a native JavaScript format, so JavaScript can consume it right away, as opposed to taking XML and having to do some kind of transformation to work with it. JSON is used by many client-side frameworks because it is this sort of native JavaScript format. So if you're doing any work in mobile, you know that one of the big pushes there is with HTML5 and JavaScript to get a lot of stuff done, sort of a cross-platform way of developing the client part of the application. And so you'll see JSON being consumed by all kinds of clients, from your desktop web applications to your mobile applications. And because it's becoming so popular, even some applications that really don't work with JSON natively, they're not JavaScript oriented, they appreciate the lightweight format of JSON and the popularity of it, and so they are starting to consume JSON even if that's not their typical way of dealing with data. And so we might say that in a lot of ways JSON is eclipsing XML for a lot of the common things that we use data transfer for between a client and a server. Now, I want to make it clear that XML is not going away anytime soon. In fact, there's any number of technologies that rely on XML as a data interchange format. And so XML is still a very powerful way to define data interchange between systems, and we're not going to get rid of it. But at the same time, for a lot of the things that we need that data interchange for, JSON will serve quite well and has a lot of advantages. And so you're going to see JSON becoming even more and more popular as time goes on. You're probably going to see XML less and less. So how do we get the Web API to return JSON, and what's that going to be like? Well, when we send a request to the Web API, we have to request what content type we want to get back. Because anytime you ask a service to return you a result, that result could come back in all kinds of ways. That service could be trying to send you HTML, could be trying to send you XML, could even be trying to send you a PDF or something. And so when we send a request to the service, what we usually do is we put in a content type for the response that we want back. And so when we start asking the Web API for data. We're going to be requesting it as JSON. When we get that data back, it's going to be immediately usable by JavaScript. We don't have to do any magic to it because it's already in a format that JavaScript understands. So when we get that data back, we can operate on it immediately. If you've used Ajax in the past with XML, Ajax frameworks now are sophisticated enough that you don't have to do a whole lot, but at least at one time we had to do a lot of serializing and deserializing and communicating between XML and JavaScript, and JSON just eliminates that layer altogether. This is one of the reasons it's good for mobile apps, is because it's so lightweight. The data transfer is very fast. The mobile apps don't have to deal with a lot of data, either in memory or in transit. And when we write our mobile apps, if we are making them in HTML5 and JavaScript, we don't need to put a lot of code into that mobile app to handle changing the data format into a way our application can use. One thing I also want to say is that JSON does not require special code. JSON is sort of the default, if you will, of the Web API. If for some reason you specified no content type, it's going to return you JSON. And so we don't have to do a lot of special things with the Web API if JSON is the data format we decide we want to work with. And this is a big advantage to JSON as well, is you just have to code less. And when we're trying to get applications out as fast as possible, this is kind of a big deal. So let's talk about XML. What if we want XML back from the service? Well, one of the things that I want to say up front is that no code needs to change in terms of the way we ask the Web API for data. In other words, if I set up a bunch of Ajax calls to the Web API to get data back, I don't necessarily have to change those calls. The logic of going out to a URL, asking it for data, getting that data stream back, and passing it to some kind of callback function, all the things that we're used to doing with Ajax, none of that code needs to change. However, when you make the request, you need to specify that you want application/XML as your return type, because otherwise the Web API is going to try to return you JSON. But if you ask it specifically for XML, it's smart enough to know that you want XML back. This is why, for example, if we open up Internet Explorer and we test a Web API method, by default, Internet Explorer is going to give us a JSON response. If we use Chrome or Firefox, we're going to get XML back because it automatically requests that MIME type and displays it a certain way. You can also use a specific URL pattern. In the query string, you can ask the resource for a specific content type. In your query string, you can say you want XML back or you want JSON back. This is not typically the way we do it. Obviously, doing this in the URL is going to make it visible to the client, first of all. And second of all, we are sort of, once again, getting away from the REST protocols that we're used to. We want to be able to use the standard HTTP stuff to get the job done. And so setting the content type in the actual request makes a lot more sense for a RESTful service. All right, so I want to spend some time showing you how we can request JSON or request XML from the Web API. And in doing so, we're going to use a little bit of it, but the focus is going to be on requesting that data and getting it back in a format that we can use in our applications. This is going to be a web application, and I just want to point out a couple of things. First of all, I've just set up a basic div here. We've got title, author, and price, and I've got spans. This is where our data is going to go. So I've given these IDs for the purposes of showing you how this works. Now, obviously, if this were a real web application, we would make it much more elaborate and much prettier, but you will definitely be able to see the way this data is going to be working. One thing I also wanted to do is go ahead and include jQuery. jQuery is by default the way your Microsoft MVC applications are going to access Ajax. If you use some other framework, or even if you use no other framework at all, you can still absolutely use this. You're just going to have to write a little bit more plumbing code yourself. For my purposes, I'm going to use jQuery's libraries to do AJAX. That's going to be by far and away the most common way people writing Microsoft web apps are going to be doing this, but I want to make it clear that you do not have to use jQuery to do this. Anything that you use to make AJAX calls, this is going to be just as applicable, even if some of the syntax might be a little bit different in your case. So I've got this page set up, and on my web API side, I've got this books controller, and it has a get method to get all the books, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this get method here for the purposes of showing you how to get data out. And it's going to take an ID, and then it's going to find a book, and it's going to send me that book back in JSON format. Now, if for some reason it can't find a book that has my ID, instead it's going to send me a 404. That resource wasn't found, and then I'm going to have these cool little error messages in here. So in my code back here, in order to consume this service, I'm going to put in some JavaScript. Okay, so we put in our script tags, and I'm going to write a function to consume the web API and give us some JSON back. So I'm just going to write this function, and I'm just going to say get book by ID, and when I call this function I need to pass it in an ID, and I also need to specify the function that is going to run on success. And so in this particular case, I'm going to pass in a callback function for it to run. There are, of course, other ways to do this. You may have a preferred way of setting up your callbacks. For the purposes of showing this, this is probably going to be the simplest way. So in using jQuery, I'm going to use their AJAX method. Once again, this is not the only method you could use. It's just the one I'm going to be using here. And the thing about JavaScript is it can be really tricky to make sure that you've closed all your brackets and parentheses, so I tend to like to do that in advance, but that's just personal preference. So first thing I need to do is give it a URL. Okay. Where am I going to access this data? And so the URL I'm going to use is /API. All of our web API calls need to have that as part of the code. And I am going to ask for the books controller. Okay, so there's my URL. Now I need to send it an ID. Remember, my controller is expecting an ID, so I'm going to send it some data. And this ID parameter is looking for, I'm just going to set it as the ID that's being called into the function. Okay, I want to make this clear. This is the parameter the controller is looking for. This is the value that's getting passed into the JavaScript function. In fact, just to make that a little bit clearer, I'm going to call that the JS ID, just so it's easier for you to see that that's where that value is coming from. The type is going to be the HTTP method of this request, and I'm going to change it to get. Set it to get, just because all I'm doing is getting data back. This is a read operation. Now, this is where you can kind of see where HTTP methods become important, because if I were actually editing this book as opposed to just getting data about it, then I would just change this type to put, and my web API controller would automatically know to use its put action. It's because of this HTTP method here. In this case, get is just fine. I'm going to set the content type of the response that I want back. This is going to be application JSON, and I'm going to set the character set to UTF-8, just a common universal character set. And we would be good to go with just this, but I'm going to do one more step. I'm actually going to put in some code to deal with status codes, because remember, we could get back a status code that says 404 not found, right? I might send it an ID that doesn't actually exist in the database. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell my AJAX call that if what I get back is 200 for my status code, then go ahead and execute my callback function, whatever that's going to be. and pass it the book that I got back. This is going to be JSON data. If I get a 404, that means the book wasn't found. So what do I want to do in that case? Well, I'm just going to alert. Now I could, query the response for an error message and display the error message, and if this were a production application, that might be exactly what I want to do. But in this case, I'm just going to alert that the book was not found. Okay. So there's my JavaScript, and that will make the call, but if the call is successful, it's going to execute a callback function. Okay, so what I want to do is write a callback function. Actually, let me do this below it so you can see the difference. This is going to be the function that's going to run when this actually gets called and I get a successful result back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a little routine here called getBookById. I'm just going to call this function directly in my JavaScript runtime as opposed to clicking a button or something. So this is just part of my JavaScript. I'm just going to call this function as part of the normal sequence of events. And getBookById needs a book ID, and it needs a callback function. So I'm going to make the ID of the book 1, because I know that's in there. And now I'm going to write my callback function. What's going to get executed if I get 200 back as my status? Well, I'm going to get a book back as JSON data. Okay. And what do I want to do with this? So I've got my book as JSON data. It's already a JavaScript object. I don't need to do any magic to serialize it or deserialize it. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change the properties of those spans up there to reflect the data I get back. So the title's HTML. And watch this. It's going to be the book.title. If you're curious as to where that comes from, and it might be good to show you, the book object looks like this. So I'm getting back properties like ID, title, author, and price. Right? That's already in my JavaScript object all ready to go. Copy and paste a few times. I know that gets people into trouble sometimes, but I think it'll work okay for us. I want to do the same thing with the author. I want to do the same thing with the price. It's going to be the book's author and the book's price. Okay, so when I spin this up, what should happen is when this page comes up, this is going to make a request out to this API. It's going to send the ID of 1. It's going to get, ideally, a JSON response back that has that book data, and it's just going to plug that JSON into these tags up here. And that's exactly what happens. Title, author, price. So if I change the JavaScript to ask for a different ID, and of course, normally what we would want to do is put in something dynamic that would allow you to choose what ID you wanted instead of hard coding it, but you can see how this works. So I put in an ID of 2 and fire it up. Book ID 2. If I put in an ID of 17, there is no book with an ID of 17. Book not found, okay, because I got a 404 response back from the Web API. That's how you do it, and the only thing that really needs to change to get XML back is I'm going to change this to XML instead of JSON. And now I'm going to get XML back, but I may have to do a little bit more plumbing in my JavaScript to change the XML into a JavaScript object that I can use right away. The beauty of just requesting JSON back is this code works just as it is. It's already JavaScript and it's all ready for us to use.